The smell hit them first, not the perfume of roses that had always lingered around the Tudor court, nor the incense that burned constantly in the royal chapels. No, what drifted through the air in those final years was a stench so foul, so unmistakably human, that even the most seasoned courtiers were seen discreetly pressing silk handkerchiefs to their noses. Some could not hide their revulsion and fled the royal presence to be sick in the shadows. But what they smelled was not simply the decay of a body, it was the decay of a king who had once been the golden prince of Christendom, a king who now sat rotting in his own skin while the weight of his paranoia crushed an entire nation. And yet, this is not how Henry VIII began. In his youth, he was adored, athletic, charming, a Renaissance man in every sense. He wrote poetry, played music, rode like a warrior, and debated with scholars. To the world, he seemed invincible. But history hides a brutal secret. His fall into horror, his transformation into something grotesque, began with one single moment, one accident, one shattering day in January 1536 that changed England forever. Picture this: Greenwich Palace, January 24th, a bitter winter afternoon. The tilt yard is alive with spectacle. Thousands crowd into the stands, cloaks pulled tight against the cold, breath clouding in the frosty air. Drums roll, trumpets sound, and down the long stretch of packed earth comes the thunder of hooves. At 44, Henry is still a giant of a man, broad-shouldered, powerful, resplendent in armor crafted by the finest smiths of Europe. The sun glints off polished steel, dazzling the crowd. This is their king, at his most magnificent. But magnificence has its price. The lances lower. Two armored titans thunder toward each other with the force of a modern collision. The crowd roars, then gasps. Something has gone terribly wrong. The horses collide, and in an instant, Henry is flung to the frozen earth. The weight of his destrier, its own armor clattering like a falling fortress, comes crashing down upon him. The ground itself seems to shudder. And then, silence. The king does not move. For 2 long hours, England has no monarch, 2 hours in which his queen, Anne Boleyn, pregnant with the child she believes will secure her life, waits trembling for news. 2 hours in which the court whispers of omens, of curses, of God's judgment, and when Henry finally opens his eyes, he is not the same man. Witnesses describe a change, a strange darkness in his gaze, a fury that rose too quickly. His first words are not relief, not gratitude. They are rage. Rage that the tournament had been stopped, that anyone dared interfere with his glory. That day, something inside Henry shifted. Modern doctors would recognize the signs of traumatic brain injury, damage to the very part of the brain that controls impulse and personality. The Golden Prince, who once laughed with scholars and courted ladies with poetry, was gone. In his place emerged a tyrant whose moods swung like the blade of an executioner. But that was only the beginning. The accident did more than shatter his mind. It reopened an old wound on his leg, a wound that never healed again, a wound that began to rot him slowly, day by agonizing day. At first, it was just a sore hidden beneath silks and boots, but infection is a patient enemy. The leg swelled, the skin split. From the wounds came a discharge that stank so strongly that even physicians could barely approach. Bronze bowls were filled daily, sometimes twice daily, with fluids drained from the king's body. Imagine the humiliation of a man once worshipped for his strength, now reduced to a source of horror. And yet Henry, proud and paranoid, sought to hide it. He ordered special devices made, lead weights to press against the ulcers, believing pressure might force them shut. Instead, it strangled the circulation, feeding the infection. Perfumes from Arabia, rose oil, ambergris, he drenched himself in them. He forced his portrait painters to show him standing tall, athletic, with legs of iron. The truth was very different. Beneath the silks, his flesh was turning against him. His body was poisoning itself, and with the poison came madness. Think of the worst pain you've ever known. A toothache, a broken bone. Now imagine it never ends. Imagine it pulsing with every heartbeat, seeping into your blood, gnawing at your nerves day and night for years. That was Henry's existence. Every step was agony. Every night was fever. Every day was a cycle of training, dressing, disguising, denying. But pain does not stay contained. It creeps into the mind, warping thought, twisting reason. By 1540, the change was terrifying. The handsome monarch, who had once been hailed as England's Apollo, had become a grotesque figure, swollen with flesh, his temper as unpredictable as a storm. He no longer needed a reason to condemn. Friends became enemies overnight. Thomas Cromwell, once his most trusted adviser, found himself on the scaffold. Wives were discarded or destroyed. And through it all, Henry ate and ate, seeking solace in food, even as his body ballooned to monstrous proportions. His armor from the Tower of London tells the tale, waistlines expanding year after year until they rivaled the width of modern furniture. The palace itself groaned under his weight. Floors reinforced, doorways widened, chairs rebuilt to bear the bulk of a king. Servants struggled to lift him into bed, into chairs, onto horses, and behind closed doors. The ulcers grew worse, the pus grew darker, the smell unbearable. Physicians described it in terms they dared not speak aloud at court: gangrene, corruption, death alive within the body. But Henry would not allow himself to be remembered as weak. He clung to power with iron hands, forcing his crumbling body into public rituals, demanding obedience, lashing out at anyone who wavered. And in the shadows of Hampton Court, rumors began to spread. Rumors of the king talking to himself, of him arguing with phantoms no one else could see, of him staring into the void and whispering as if to an unseen enemy. It is here that the line between sickness and damnation began to blur. Was this the result of infection, of fever, of a poisoned mind? Or was Henry, who had defied pope and priest alike, now haunted by the souls of those he had condemned? Witnesses reported him screaming at empty chairs, demanding that Anne Boleyn stop mocking him. He spoke to his dead mother. He argued with his long-dead brother Arthur. He accused shadows of plotting his downfall. The once mighty King of England was unraveling before their eyes. And yet, through fear, the court played along. Official proclamations spoke of his recovery, of his health, of his continued vigor. But within those chambers, reality was a nightmare. Servants fainted at the stench of his body. Courtiers carried pomanders of herbs to mask the air. Ladies fled to vomit after audiences. And Henry, oblivious, furious, terrified, clung to his throne. This is the horror of power. This is what it means to decay while still wearing a crown. And yet, everything I've told you so far is only the beginning. Because what happened in those last months of Henry's life, the visions, the screams, the secret cover-ups, is more terrifying than anything you've heard. Historians tried to bury it. Officials rewrote the records, but fragments survive. Diaries hidden in libraries, physicians' notes locked away, whispers carried across centuries. And when we piece them together, they reveal not just the death of a man, but the death of something larger, the death of England's golden age, the end of a dynasty, consumed by its own corruption. So listen carefully, because in Section 2, you will witness the final decline of Henry VIII, a decline so ghastly, so relentless, that his government concealed it for nearly 500 years. You will see how the mighty king did not die peacefully, as history books claim, but in terror, in delirium, and in agony. And once you know the truth, you will never look at that famous portrait, the one with the wide stance and the piercing eyes, the same way again. January 1547. Whitehall Palace groaned beneath the weight of winter frost. The Thames outside lay frozen, and the courtyards were hushed with dread. Behind shuttered windows, the King of England lay dying, not as the histories would later tell it, peacefully in his sleep, but in a state that no mortal should endure. By now, Henry's body was a battleground. His once mighty legs had split open into gaping ulcers, the flesh blackened, the stench overpowering. Servants fainted when changing his sheets. Even the most hardened physicians gagged as they drained bowls of fluid from his rotting flesh. The infection had spread beyond control. The man who once inspired poets was now described in secret diaries as a corpse that had not yet stopped breathing. His skin was jaundiced, his eyes yellow and sunken, his tongue swollen so grotesquely he could barely form words. He weighed so much that 6 men were required to turn him in bed. And even then, the pressure of his bulk tore his own skin open, adding fresh sores to the catalogue of decay. His breath carried the smell of meat left to rot in the sun. And yet, even in this state, Henry clung to power with a tyrant's grip. The physicians knew the truth. They recorded it quietly, then sealed their notes away. For the court maintained its fiction. The king was merely resting, recovering, preparing to rise again. Ambassadors were reassured, proclamations were signed in his name, and all the while, behind closed doors, the Privy Council planned for succession. They knew it was only a matter of days, but Henry himself did not go quietly. In those final nights, his mind became a theater of horrors. Witnesses wrote of him crying out for his dead mother, Elizabeth of York, as if she stood at his bedside. He begged her to keep demons at bay, clawing at the air with his one functioning hand. He apologized to his brother Arthur for stealing his crown and his wife. He called out to Catherine of Aragon, the wife he had cast aside, pleading for forgiveness. And most hauntingly, he spoke to children that never lived, miscarriages and stillbirths that had haunted his desperate quest for an heir. He wept for them, begged them to return, promised he would be a better father. But when the fever rose, his words changed. He screamed about fire. He raved about shadows at the foot of his bed. He accused servants of poisoning him, forcing them to apply his ointments to their own skin before he would allow them near. He ranted at phantoms no one else could see, insisting that Anne Boleyn mocked him from the darkness. One night, he demanded a chair pulled up so that he could shout at her ghost directly. His counselors stood frozen in silence as the King of England cursed an empty seat. By January 20th, his body began to shut down. His kidneys faltered, his abdomen swelled grotesquely with fluid, and his urine turned dark, almost black. Every movement brought cries of agony. His strength was so far gone that his once feared signature had become nothing more than a trembling scrawl. And yet, even then, he tried to sign death warrants. His last intended victim, the Duke of Norfolk, escaped the axe only because Henry himself died before the ink dried. But here lies the secret. Henry VIII did not die with dignity. He did not die in peace. The official story, crafted carefully by his council, was a lie. Archbishop Thomas Cranmer's private diary, discovered centuries later, gives us the closest glimpse into those final hours. On the night of January 27th, he was summoned to Whitehall to give the king his last rites. What he found was not a sovereign slipping gently into eternity, but a monstrous figure convulsing in torment. 6 men struggled to hold Henry down as seizures racked his swollen body. His massive frame thrashed so violently that the bed frame cracked. Between fits, he vomited black bile that stained the sheets, the smell forcing even the archbishop to leave the room twice in order to compose himself. And when the fits subsided, Henry's eyes would focus on things no one else could see. He cried out for his lost children, then shrieked about flames consuming him, demanding that someone, anyone, put out a fire that was not there. He swore he saw demons clawing their way up from beneath the bed. He begged for his mother's protection, then cursed her in the same breath. In moments of brief lucidity, he promised wealth to anyone who could save him, only to rage seconds later that his physicians deserved torture for their failure. Then came the sound. Those who have sat with the dying know it. The death rattle, a gurgling, wet hiss as the lungs fill with fluid, each breath a drowning. For hours, Henry fought, gasping, choking, clawing at the sheets, as though trying to hold on to life by sheer force of will. The mightiest king England had ever known, reduced to a creature struggling for air. At 2 in the morning, on January 20th, 1547, Henry VIII gave one final convulsion. A roar, half scream, half gasp, shook the chamber. Then, silence. England's most feared monarch was gone. But even in death, his horror was not finished. As his body was prepared for burial, the stench became impossible to contain. Courtiers whispered that dogs broke into the church where his coffin was held and lapped at the fluids seeping from it. Chroniclers recorded that his corpse swelled and burst, though whether this is fact or legend, none can say. What is certain is that his remains were hurried into the ground at Windsor in a plain vault, far humbler than his pride would have allowed. And then came the rewriting. His death was officially described as serene. The thrashing, the screams, the visions, they vanished from the records. Portraits were altered. The walking stick topped with a skull, once painted in his grasp, was painted over. The story of Henry's last hours became a tale of calm, of dignity, of a monarch passing in sleep. The truth was buried along with his body. But fragments remain. Cranmer's diary, suppressed physicians' notes, the whispers of ambassadors who dared to write down what they saw, and when pieced together, they reveal something terrifying. Not just the decay of a man, but the decay of power itself. Because what we see in Henry's end is not merely sickness. It is a reflection of what happens when a man believes himself greater than God, greater than nature, greater than the limits of flesh. His body, once the envy of Europe, became his prison. His mind, once sharp and cunning, became a haunted ruin. The king who reshaped a nation, who defied Rome and crowned himself supreme head of the church, died not as a ruler, but as a husk, screaming into shadows, terrified of the judgment he had always denied. And perhaps that is why his story still unsettles us, not because of the ulcers or the rot or the madness, but because it forces us to ask, when power corrupts so absolutely, what remains of the human being beneath? Was Henry VIII a victim of his own body, or was his monstrous death a fitting end for a monstrous reign? Even today, when you stand before his portrait in the National Portrait Gallery, the one with the wide stance, the piercing stare, the hands on hips, you know the truth. Behind the paint lies not a king at his peak, but a man hiding a body that was already rotting, a mind already breaking, a soul already hunted by ghosts. So the next time you hear the name Henry VIII, don't think of the music, the wives, the grand portraits. Remember the stench that filled Whitehall. Remember the screams that echoed through the night of January 27th. Remember the king who died not as a monarch in glory, but as a man consumed by his own corruption, terrified of shadows only he could see. Because in the end, Henry IV did not just reshape England, he left behind a legacy of horror, proof that even the mightiest kings cannot escape the slow, merciless hand of decay.